Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Is this on? Hopefully, or do I speak here? I guess I speak here. Hi. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this. I'm glad it worked to be here. This has always been such a wonderful event. I'm sorry I couldn't have been here for more of it. So yes, I am Brian Wieser at GroupM. Some of you may know me from my time at Pivotal Research or from time at Simul Media or Interpublic. But now I'm here. And so what I want to talk about, frankly, the Ehrenberg Bass people are going to tell you far more about how brands grow than I ever could. But I do have some thoughts, and hopefully I can contextualize it with the view that I have of the broader industry. We just produced our brand new global forecast for advertising. Yesterday, you can get the PDF forecast at groupm.com. You can email me, brian.wieser@groupm.com if you want it. And if you want our data sets too, and you're not a competitor, I'll send it to you. Just email me. Anyways, so, I was asked to talk first of all about what the fundamental purpose of brands are. This is something I've started to put together, and there's a big difference in terms of how I need to think in this role, where the clients that we service are the world's largest marketers, versus my old job where institutional investors were my clients. Now, what I did here is I take some of the old knowledge I had, namely, I scanned through 80 different earnings call transcripts from many of the world's largest marketers, and I built a word cloud to look at what came up in earnings calls from those marketers. What's really interesting is this word growth at the center. Maybe it's not a surprise, but it's still really interesting to see it in this form. That when you think about what the world's largest marketers, their CEOs, their CFOs, and the sell-side analysts who are engaged in dialogue with them on earnings calls, that is the thing that comes up the most, at least a plurality more than any other word. And so when we think about what is the purpose of a brand, the purpose of a brand is to support a company's growth. It's not the only way to drive growth, but it certainly is one of the key ways. And I think it's worth keeping this word cloud in mind when we're thinking about what really drives decision making and what should we be, certainly if we are in our agency services roles or media owners, what is our job? Our job is to support this. And so the context of paid media, it sounds weird in some cases because here I am working for the world's largest media services entity. We have $50 billion of annual spending on behalf of our clients. And I can say, well, media only matters so much. I mean, sure, it's important. I mean, it kind of pays the bills. But let's put the context of media in the forefront here. So we published something recently where we estimated how big the global marketing industry is. I get to about a $1.6 to $1.9 trillion number. Media is certainly a large chunk of it, but not necessarily the biggest. I can get to a $700 billion number, depending on your definition. Interestingly, if you look at agency services, we can get to about $150 billion. If we include software, marketing tech software primarily, but also ad tech software, another $150 billion. And then there's this somewhere between 0.6 and 0.9 trillion of other. That means sales, that means other forms of marketing events, in-house activities that different marketers engage in. So it's important to keep in mind what media's role is. It is not necessary for all brands to use media. That doesn't mean they shouldn't or they can't, and doesn't mean that media can't be a key source of growth. But let's keep in mind that there are many different ways for marketers to drive their growth. And we need to always be mindful of why media may or may not be a better solution for a marketer in a given situation in accomplishing a given goal. Now, to put this in context of where the growth trends are, and this is more a summary of what we just published, the global advertising economy is decelerating. It's interesting that here we are right ahead of an election that's in the center of geopolitics in some senses of it. But around the world, we see a lot of uncertainty, and that is dragging on economies. And we see this in these growth rates. It's trade wars are probably paramount, and it's not just the U.S. and China. There are other countries that are engaging in tit-for-tat tariffs. That is one factor. A reduction in global investment, weakening industrial production. All these factors are negative, and so we need to keep that in mind. The U.S. is still certainly doing quite well despite these conditions, but the likelihood of it sustaining recent growth rates is not great. It will still grow, just not as fast as it has. This, by the way, just shows the impact of political advertising, which I'm estimating at $10 billion next year. The UK is also strangely resilient. It's hard to bet against the UK's advertising economy right now. That said, the underlying economy itself isn't doing anywhere near as well as the advertising market. So we want to keep that in mind, that there's some reason why the UK is outperforming where it probably should be. I have theories about that, save that for another presentation. At a global level, China is a major drag. Right now, we're estimating only 1.4% growth next year. And when we look at the typical country, we saw growth that outperformed the overall global average in the first part of the century. Well, the average country is now underperforming the global average. So that means all these countries outside of the US and the UK essentially are really a drag on global advertising. And so conditions are weak. We have maybe 14 countries, I think, are negative this year, actually declining, some of which have healthy economies, but their advertising markets are not. And so this leads us to this point here about, okay, what to do in a downturn. And I think, when we think about what's going on in the UK, I mean, there's so much uncertainty with respect to Brexit and what happens this week, next month, next year. But I think that these ideas for what to do if a downturn hits are applicable in any given country and under any given circumstance. And maybe just to the first point, as a general rule, I can say that the advertising market will be weak. Does that mean that every marketer should therefore cut spending? Probably not. That said, it's also worth noting that if the UK has a strong advertising market, but a weak economy, is it better to think about, well, wait, maybe deploy resources to a market like Switzerland, where you have a weak ad market, but a strong economy, or at least a solid one? It's really important not to just mimic your behaviors if you're a marketer based on what you see every other marketer doing. Preferably doing something different is a good thing. Funding long-term growth is important, and this is hard, I know, because if you're inside of a large organization, marketing is just a small share of the total pool of expenditures to drive a business. And it's easy for the top of the company to say, cut your spending, cut your budget. To the extent that a marketer can avoid that, it is obviously, I think obviously, a good thing if you believe that marketing can drive growth. Changing media habits, this is something that's come up a lot with respect to the SVOD and AVOD services out there that are certainly in the United States much more prevalent, but I think in most other countries around the world, we'll see more of them. To the extent that we could see more consumers eliminating their pay TV services where they have them and embracing free services or embracing SVOD services. Keeping on top of those changing habits is critical. Creative tone, hopefully that's self-explanatory, that if the world is feeling down, maybe mimicking it might be the right thing or the wrong thing. And this idea of being mindful of the mix between whether you're spending money on media versus services versus software. Obviously the self-interested piece would be that, well, of course, every marketer should just double what they're spending on their agencies in a downturn because it's more effective spending, right? But not necessarily. I mean, for a given marketer, it could very well be that the downturn is the time to create a brand new digital experience, invest heavily in a MarTech solution to support some brand initiatives. And that might be the better choice. But I think it's important to assess what really drives the best bang for the buck. in a given point in time. There is no such thing as no bad opportunity in a downturn. The topic of insourcing is something that comes up quite a lot. And I think that certainly when there are economic pressures, I think many brands are at least intrigued with the possibility of reducing their costs by bringing agency services in-house, doing things themselves if they think it can eliminate what they're spending on agency services. There are cases where that makes sense, but in most cases it does not. So again, we've written in some detail about these points, about when it can make sense for a marketer to bring their agency-like services, their media trading in-house. And in fact, we even have services to support clients who choose to do that. But it is worth keeping in mind that bringing media in-house is not typically going to be a cheaper solution. The pursuit of it should be because it happens to be a better solution. It happens to be that you've got a different business need that could only be met by bringing all those functions in-house. I think that best practices are probably the single most important thing that an agency can usually bring to bear to a client. It's, even the world's largest marketers are usually not anywhere near as big as at least the 5 or 6 biggest media agency groups. And so it's not likely that the largest marketers will have the depth of experience or the range of brand experience that any given agency has. But that said, it can be that marketers' business strategies might evolve such that they need ridiculously tight integration with the brand owner. And the notion of the hand-on keyboard is it's critical to what the business has become. And again, we understand why direct-to-consumer brands have often started their businesses this way and they keep doing it. But it's worth noting that there are relatively few direct-to-consumer brands that have gotten past $100 million or 100 million pounds of revenue. Once you get to a certain size, if you want to actually build your brand to something bigger, certainly the expertise that agencies have goes a long way towards helping them. So to a final point, I was asked to speak about the short versus long-term interests that brands may have and how to think about that. It's interesting. Far too often, companies will attack analysts and the investment community by saying, oh, analysts, investors are so short-term oriented. That's often what comes from companies who don't have the trust of the investment community, possibly because they don't deserve it in many cases. The vast majority of the investment industry want to have a long time horizon. They just need to be persuaded that they should give a company a long time horizon. And so that speaks to a bigger point, that when a marketer speaks, thinks, acts with long-term best interests in mind, they will persuade investors, if they're credible, that that company is focused on long-term actions. In my old job, my biggest client probably had $20 billion of assets under management, 20 investment professionals, maybe 20 positions. So imagine you have $1 billion position in a given company, and you're one person. You can't just go in and out. You don't want that. You want to have a multi-year time horizon. And there are many institutional investors who are not dissimilar from that. They really want to have a long-term time horizon. But companies need to give them a reason to have that long-term time horizon. So when we think about brand building, it's sort of the perfect example of a long-term time horizon, because it's hard to tell that any action supporting a brand necessarily causes a business impact in a current quarter. But when a company demonstrates an ongoing interest in building and supporting and reinforcing their brands, it can support this narrative that the company is itself focused on the long term and is not worried about the short term because they're convinced in their long-term strategy. And so to the extent that companies realize that investors will support a long-term strategy if they just do what's necessary, brands have a better chance to grow and companies can grow because of their brands. So with that, thank you. You can sign up for our newsletter or reach me anytime if you have questions. Thank you.